Rutendo Matinyarare.
Yes, my guy.
Welcome again to your new home. I think you're becoming a family member now. On some days, maybe you must come and sit this side and bash me and attack me and, you owe me. You owe us. And it's my fault, and I apologize. I disrupted you the last time you sat here because I had a wish for you to unpack, let's just say, the South African economy. If it gets to it, we can discuss aspects of the African economy. But the South African economy, because those have been some of my favorite videos from you. Just like the first conversation we had where you schooled people on history, you've schooled so many people on how this economy works. So I'm hoping that today we can speak about that. And if there's anything else you want to speak about as well, please feel free. And unlike last time, I'm going to try and take a back seat and let you educate us and be less disagreeable.
I understand. Thanks so much for that. And today I really wanted us to home in on the structure of the financial system of South Africa and the business economy of South Africa, but carrying the same thread that we had from the first episode, where we're talking about the continuous need for control that our colonizers still have on the African continent.
Yeah.
Because that's the one thing that we need to understand is we don't have these conversations just for the sake of having the conversations. We're actually trying to change something in the minds of our people who keep complaining about being oppressed, but they keep doing the things that enable the oppression.
Sure.
And they keep creating the instruments that allow the oppression, which brings us to the topic that we're going to talk about today: banking, the finance system, and the control of that banking system, the control of loans and credit, and the movement of money, and how that continues to be our biggest oppressor till today.
Before we start, for a person that's going to be watching this conversation for the first time and being introduced to you for the first time, what do you do? What do you stand for?
I'm a marketing and brand strategist by profession.
Okay.
And for many years, my biggest clients were American.
Hey, Sanda Matola.
I was having big clients, the big corporates, fast-moving consumer goods producers, marketing products to Africa. And then I read a book that told me that America's biggest weapon to the world is consumption.
Yes.
They've forced and it persuaded people to consume and to consume unnecessary things and to make people addicted to that consumption, that people no longer serve interests that are supposed to advance them because they want to consume more. And that is
America's biggest weapon
is
getting other nations to be consumers.
Absolutely.
Hectic.
Our passion for cars, our passion for cell phones, the latest iPhone 14 and games. Fast foods. Pharmaceuticals. People have become addicted to what they call medicine. 100%. And that is how the Americans have captured us. And I even say, many people say that China is actually going to take over from America. I think China is already captured by this American syndrome. That's why the Chinese are so brand conscious. And by being brand conscious, you've been defeated by the Americans through consumption. But the Chinese are also getting us to consume. But them getting to consume with factories that are funded by American money, controlled by BlackRock, controlled by Fidelity, controlled by State Street, controlled by the big four shadow banks of America, actually means that Chinese consumption is actually American profit. Jeez. Sorry, what? After you read the book, did it change you? Yes. So the moment I realized that my job was to advance consumption, and I'm doing that at the detriment of Africa, which has no image, no identity, no brand. People don't want to be African or associated with being African. Our youth, including myself when I grew up, it's all about American culture. We want to speak like Americans. We want to act like Americans. We want to dress like Americans. I realized that I shouldn't be focusing on getting Africans to be consumers. I should be focusing on rebuilding the psychology and the brand of Africa for young African youth to want to be African once again, for young African youth to identify as Africans and to establish what it is that Africa is supposed to give to the world. And it is bringing out that essence and promise that Africans stand for that I now am dedicated to. And so part of the program of me redeeming Zimbabwe's image was to fight sanctions, because sanctions were saying we're punishing this government for violating human rights. And for that reason, we've put it under sanctions until it transforms. That was a nonsense story. It was about punishing Zimbabweans for taking their land and empowering their people. And I needed the world to know that. And the way to make the world know that was to fight sanctions, take it into the international arena, take it to the UN and get the UN to make a pronouncement that the sanctions on Zimbabwe were actually illegal. They were not about human rights violations, but it was about the West violating Zimbabwe and trying to keep it down so that it cannot use its educated workforce, its resources and its land to improve its people's lives.
Still doing brand and strategy, but more for the upliftment of Africans and the African psyche.
100%.
Thank you. What do you want to speak to us about? I see you've got your book here.
Yes, I've got my book here today. I probably will not really refer much to the notes, but I want structure.
No, nothing wrong.
So what the problem is today is South Africa doesn't realize that we are sitting in this end of year period, and the South African government, the South African parliament have got a task to create laws and policies that are going to determine how money flows in South Africa going into the future. And the laws that we're being forced to create in this period are not laws that are supposed to advance South Africa, but they're supposed to advance the countries that are forcing us to make these laws. Now, many people don't know what I'm talking about. We, as Black people, spend too much time doing amapiano. And even white people don't know that South Africa has been put on what is called the FATF, or the Financial Action Task Force, potential to be put on a grey list. So they are flagging the South African financial system, saying that this organization that is called the Financial Action Task Force. So let me define that a little bit. So the Financial Action Task Force is a private organization that has been created by the G7 nations. Well, G7 nations, as you would know, are the same nations that colonized Africa and colonized Asia.
Do you know them? Sorry. I know America's there. I think
America, France,
Japan.
Britain, Japan, Germany. Who have we left there?
Okay, I'll find them. Sorry. Please carry on. G7.
Those nations are the same nations that brought us colonialism, slavery. And now they're bringing us something called a continuation of colonialism and slavery through what is called neocolonialism. This neocolonialism is where you see that they continue to control the resources of the same countries that they colonized, resources and property that they got through the crimes of colonialism and slavery. They continue to control them today in what is called neocolonialism. And they even go and attack nations that have those resources that they don't control so that they can control those resources. So if you look at what has happened recently, you saw the attack on Iraq. That was not about Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction. It was about taking control of the resources that Iraq has, which is the oil. Yeah. They went and attacked Libya. They removed Gaddafi so that he wouldn't introduce the gold dinar, and so that he would also not continue to control the oil that he was using to advance Africa and to grow Africa. If you understand, the ANC's own liberation was funded partially by Gaddafi, hence Nelson Mandela was clear that Gaddafi was a friend to South Africa. They also attacked Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen. And the whole intention of that was to destroy the capacity of these Middle Eastern nations that were not aligned with America, creating a new system where the resources or the oils would be paid for in other currencies other than the US dollar. Libya wanted to use a gold dinar, which is a gold currency that they wanted to back up with gold and oil.
Gold-backed currencies, which we don't have anymore.
So these countries that are in the West, these G7 nations.
Sorry, to go back, if you can count them again: America, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, France, and then we left out Italy and Canada.
Yeah. 100%. So those same nations, if you look, they are what is called the Transatlantic Alliance. And the Transatlantic Alliance is a combination of the Americans with their brethren or kith and kin on the European continent, creating a system of laws and a system of institutions to control the world. Among them is the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and the World Bank. And they used these institutions together with the United Nations to create what is called international law that allows them to continue to control the resources of the world, the lands of the world, in the continuation of the doctrine of discovery that we spoke about 1454 in our first video. So it's the same pattern of trying to maintain that system of this 1454 doctrine that then became the law of nations, that is now becoming international law, that is advanced and pushed by the Americans and their transatlantic partners.
The biggest issue, or the biggest country that's an issue, is America, the United States of America. Because we can speak Italy, Canada, they're smaller countries, but if you look at the influence, who funds the most, who is the most vocal? It's the United States of America.
It's debatable because the United States of America needs the transatlantic alliance or the European partners to back up whatever it says for it to have international significance.
Okay.
So for it to influence the rest of the world, for it to look legitimate, for it to look like it's international law, they need to come together. And this is what they've done with this institution called the Financial Action Task Force. The Financial Action Task Force was created in 1989. And the institutionalization of that institution then by the Europeans and the Americans, these 7 nations, was that we want to control money laundering. We want to control drug trade or drug trafficking. So drug trafficking is causing havoc on the Americans. It's causing havoc in Europe. They're the biggest consumers of drugs because they're the richest countries on earth. And they decided that they want to do something about it. They want to control drug traffickers, particularly during the time of Pablo Escobar. So with Pablo Escobar becoming a multi-billionaire from selling drugs, probably one of the top 5 richest men in the world, they began to fear the power of this drug money and what it was doing, funding so-called terrorism and funding other activities that were outside the control of these Western nations. It was also beginning to fund resistance to the Americans on the American continent. So they decided we need to control how these drug dealers earn their money, how they're able to move their money, and how they're able to use their money to influence politics, because they were now electing politicians. Even today in Mexico and Colombia, politicians are heavily funded by drug dealers. So the Americans wanted to control that, because then they can't put their puppets if somebody else has more money than them in campaigns. So
isn't it ironic that in the world today, the biggest bulk of money still comes from drugs, but in the form of big pharma, big pharmaceuticals, because they seem to influence world politics in a major way, but it's become decentralized, but it's still drugs, except it's what we call legal.
And it's actually very interesting that you bring up that point, because when you look at that aspect of drugs in America, they say that the medical industry is the biggest industry, worth $4 trillion. And that industry is also responsible for the biggest number of deaths of Americans. It kills close to 800,000 people every single year. It kills more people than people shot by guns. It kills people more than people killed by sickness. And these are medical deaths that are caused particularly by pharmaceutical and what are called medical accidents. So isn't that ironic that the biggest industry, which is a drug-based industry, kills people?
It's drugs.
Yes.
It's just what they call legal drugs. They decide what's legal and what's not.
So they decide to create the Financial Action Task Force to control this narcotics. But what is ironic is that they're saying that they wanted to control these narcotics, but yet the biggest drug dealer and enabler of drug dealing is actually the CIA. Because they were the ones that were actually behind people like Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel and other cartels that were in South America that were controlling the drugs.
I've heard those stories.
They also went to Afghanistan to go and control the poppies that create heroin. And they're the ones that actually are behind the heroin route that comes all the way down the east coast of Africa through to South Africa. And then from South Africa, those drugs go to the rest of the world.
Jeez.
Ironically. So they create this Financial Action Task Force. 1990, they create the rules or the 40 recommendations that are supposed to be implemented by the 7 nations that were in the G7 that created these rules, plus another 16 nations that then joined to create the Financial Action Task Force in 1990 when it created these recommendations. We get to 1996, they amend those rules that had been made and add money laundering. Because now they're realizing that America, even though it is a dominant proliferator of drugs, the biggest drug dealer, even though the CIA uses drug money to fund terrorism all across the world, they now have competition.
The CIA uses drug money to fund terrorism.
Terrorism across the world. It's what they used to bring down the black movement in America when blacks were becoming more educated.
You know, people will say this is fake news.
Well, it's documented.
The CIA used drug money to fund terrorism around the world.
Yes. It's documented, and it's not documented in conspiracy theories. It's documented in newspapers. It's documented in congressional papers. It's documented in many official documents within the Congress of the United States, their own inquiries in the United States, and other places. So it's stuff that people can research. And I think that's what people need to learn when they listen to our show, is they need to learn to research for themselves. That's
Don't just say this guy's talking nonsense.
Yes.
Go and do some research.
Go and do some research.
So that when you say he's talking nonsense, you must also have something to counter. Yeah.
So come to 1996, drug dealing is still going on. Pablo Escobar has been killed, but there's still drug dealers that are controlling and instilling precedents on the South American continent and in Asia. And so they begin to say, how do we control the movement of this money? So 1996 Financial Action Task Force augments its regulations to now include money laundering and how money can move around.
Because it's not drugs now. They're sending drug money somewhere else to go and do whatever.
The drug money is becoming a problem, and it's challenging Western supremacy. It's challenging the West's ability to control the picking of politicians, the funding of companies, the funding of competitors. So they have to do something.
What's money laundering to a normal person?
So money laundering is when money is earned illegitimately through an illegitimate activity that is usually defined as a predicate crime.
Yeah.
And that predicate crime earns profits, but these profits must be spent. So they must go into the normal financial system. So the laundering of that money is cleaning up that money. So you either start a nightclub, you start a legitimate business, the legitimate business invoices, the money that is invoiced is banked, and part of what is invoiced is the money from these proceeds of this illegal activity that are then brought into the financial system. So that act of making this dirty money, clean money through a legitimate activity is actually what is called money laundering. Then it goes into the system and people can enjoy the proceeds.
You're making me wonder how much money is being laundered in the crypto space.
Before I even talk about the crypto space, we need to understand that apartheid, colonialism were all crimes against humanity.
Yeah.
So the control of people, the control of their land, control of their resources, control of their minerals was all a crime. That is accepted.
Yeah.
Apartheid was actually called a crime against humanity. So was colonialism. And laws have been made against them. And we've got so-called legitimate companies that continue to control human labor, the resources that they stole during colonialism and slavery, and the minerals that they stole during colonialism and slavery. They continue to enslave people to work in these mines. Anglo-America does it. Glencore does it. And even now, Glencore has even gone and started bribing governments all across the world. They even start wars. That money that they earn, these legitimate profits that they earn, are illegitimate.
Yeah.
And the way that they are brought into the banking system, the way that they have shares and the way that they give profits and dividends, that is actually money laundering.
Jeez.
If the tables were turned around, if what is happening with Anglo-America was happening in Europe, and if Anglo-America was African, they would be calling the proceeds of all these multinational companies, all these blue chip companies, all the companies sitting on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, their proceeds would be called money laundering proceeds, and those monies would be blocked.
I disrupted you. 1996, they include
money laundering. 1996, they include money laundering.
Yeah.
2001, we have the World Trade Center bombings.
Yeah.
Immediately a month later in October, they then create new laws that now incorporate terrorism. Now, when you hear all these things I'm saying...
By new laws, you're talking in the financial system.
Yes, in the financial system.
You're not speaking defense. You're speaking...
In the financial
system. In particular
system,
with finance.
With the Financial Action Task Force.
Yeah.
But A secret as to why that was done is then told by a guy who worked in the US Treasury, a guy by the name of Juan Zaret. Juan Zaret says, I was one of the treasury directors, and my responsibility was a treasury director for counterterrorism in the United States Treasury. And so once we had 9/11, which many people say was done by the Americans themselves,
that's then a conspiracy.
It's said to be a conspiracy.
Okay.
So we leave that one.
Sure.
But what is interesting is Juan Zaret says a month later, they sat as the US Treasury and they decided that they were going to put pressure on the Financial Action Task Force created by the G7 that had these 22 members to create new laws on controlling the movement of money, the funding of terrorism, money laundering, so that they could control the banking systems of the world.
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking of the examples you made with apartheid and colonization. And I'm thinking of the convenience. So drug trade, 1989, 1990. Money laundering, because these people don't need to move drugs, they just move money. But if we can link them to drugs. Now, years later, 2001, looking at some of these nations, the G7s, and some of the nations they have bombed, and some of the atrocities they've caused, conveniently now, because a building is bombed there, let's get the whole world to buy into this thing.
And remember, 9/11 allows them to create these rules, which a treasury director, an American, admits that we took advantage of 9/11 to create laws into the Financial Action Task Force that we were going to internationalize. So what we were going to do is we were going to say that every single financial system in the world is either with the Americans or against the Americans. When we say these people are terrorists, then we need to make sure that if we say that we are closing their accounts, every other banking system in the world must close their banking accounts.
Of those 22 nations.
Because what they did is when they created these 40 recommendations as the Financial Action Task Force, they gave it to all banks across the world. And then they said to all banks across the world, you have to implement these recommendations in your countries. You've got to make laws within your countries. You've got to create institutions like financial intelligence units in your countries. And you've got to implement these 40 recommendations, and the World Bank and the IMF will come and supervise and measure and do what I call peer reviews and assessments to see whether your banks are implementing this. And if your banks are not implementing this, then you are contaminating the international financial system. And by so doing, then we have to isolate you and your financial system from our financial system. This brings us to where South Africa is now with this threat of grey listing. What they're saying is South Africa has been compared with these 40 recommendations. And it seems South Africa is not implementing these 40 recommendations. They say, number one, South Africa is not creating enough institutions and enough investigating capacity and enough laws to stop money laundering, to stop funding of terrorism. And remember, they then added what is called the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. South Africa is not stopping these three. They've got too much organized crime in South Africa. Their police force and their investigative wings are not able to investigate and adequately catch people who are corrupt, people who are in organized crime, and people who are drug trafficking and doing any other crimes that could be bringing money laundered funds into the banking system. They're saying that South Africa trades too much in cash. The South African economy, according to one of the regulations, recommendations within the 40, is that nations should not allow too many cash transactions, because every transaction that is done should be monitored.
Yeah.
We must know who's moving money. That's why I want people to have bank accounts. But a lot of people are unbankable in South Africa, which goes to show you that these Financial Action Task Force recommendations are divorced from the realities of South Africa. So they're saying South Africa's got too many cash transactions, and a lot of cash is leaving South Africa, out of the borders of South Africa, into neighboring countries, into other African countries. And we believe that that could be funding terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction.
I want to ask a sneaky question. What is terrorism and who defines it?
Right, that's a brilliant question.
Who is a terrorist, and according to who?
When you read the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force, they define a terrorist as somebody that goes around terrorizing people, utilizing violence in order for political gains. And that definition will be tried and tested by the United Nations Security Council. That's what it says.
It's a person who does what? Uses violence to terrorize other people for political gain.
Yes.
We know who's the biggest country that does that.
100%.
Please continue.
But now the Financial Action Task Force tried to be clever. They use the definition that a designated person is a terrorist is that person that has been designated as a terrorist by the UN Security Council. But they use that selectively throughout the document. So that in certain areas, as we said, that American influence by the US Treasury in 1990, in 2001, after 9/11, deliberately wanted to ensure that America's definition of a terrorist is what is also combined with what it is that the UN defines. So now the Americans are saying, when we say somebody is a terrorist, we expect the G7 nations to back us up and the Financial Action Task Force to back us up. And those recommendations that are forcing third-party countries to implement the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force to also identify what America identifies as a terrorist, and for you to block them. Now they're saying, once we've identified somebody as a terrorist, we want you to close their account, whether there is evidence or not,
as long as we say
perpetuated terrorism.
So we watch a lot of Hollywood movies, and I think we agree that Hollywood has become one of the most powerful propaganda machines for America and maybe the CIA. When we think terrorists today, we think of an Arab man who is Muslim. And I'm just trying to think, for a normal person that's going to be listening to this conversation, can a white man be a terrorist? Can a white woman be a terrorist? Because clearly, if someone's going to say that's a terrorist, like, it can't be, doesn't look. And that becomes profiling. And that, of course, because of the movies, it's been playing in our heads that a terrorist can only look this way. It's like a criminal. When someone says, oh, but he doesn't look like a criminal. You're like, oh, he's not black. He's not wearing a hoodie. He doesn't speak broken English. It's a clean, white woman, polished. Can't be her. That's very dangerous. And when we start saying white male America gets to define what is a terrorist, because it will never be a white man.
And remember, this definition is being given by a nation where white men eliminated 50 million American Indians to then create a white world where they wiped out the natives of that land. And it's a terrorist country that terrorized American Indians and continues to terrorize American Indians, giving us a definition of what it is that is a terrorist. And that is intentional. Like we are showing you right now that the Financial Action Task Force is now being manipulated from having a total definition of a terrorist being given by the United Nations to now having a terrorist being defined by the Americans, not only in their policies, but also in their subliminal influence of our judges, our lawyers, and everybody who's going to be part and parcel of this process between now in November and January next year of making laws for South Africa that is going to define the new regulations that South Africa has to make in order to conform to the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. And the Financial Action Task Force is saying another problem is South Africa has not been identifying violent crime in South Africa adequately as terrorism. And they believe that some of the drug crime that you've got in Western Cape, some of the taxi violence that you've got in this country, some of the violent crimes that you've got in this country should be adequately defined as terrorism and should be designated as terrorism. And the people that are perpetrating these crimes should be designated as terrorists, and their funds should be blocked accordingly. And therefore, they should have their properties confiscated. Now, that again confuses me, because the definition of a terrorist should be done at the UN. But the Financial Action Task Force is asking South Africa and the South African Parliament, the South African government, to make legislation that criminalizes any violent crime and categorizes it as terrorism. And those funds should be treated as money laundering and terrorism, and also potentially the financing of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Now, before we go, remember that the first country to come up with nuclear weapons was America, followed by Russia. Any other time that technology was sent through to other countries or was acquired by other countries is considered as proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And the non-proliferation treaties existed by the time that America was giving technology for the manufacturing of nuclear weapons to the South African government, to Israel, which gave it to the South African government, to France, which gave it to Israel, and which gave it to the South African government. That was proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. When it was done by the Americans, it was not considered to be funding of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. But now that all the Western countries have got weapons of mass destruction to defend themselves, the moment that Russia tries to give that technology to Iran, the moment China tries to give that technology to North Korea, all of a sudden, it is proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, which must be punished and criminalized as a crime by the Financial Action Task Force and all financial institutions. So what they're saying is the moment that non-white nations want to learn how to have nuclear weapons and want to get that technology from the countries that have it, those countries are criminal. Their proceeds and monies to fund those activities shall be criminalized, considered as money laundering, and considered as funding terrorism and funding the proliferation. So it's basically they don't want us to compete. It's the same reason that they have these money laundering laws. Now that Africans are all over the continent, they're all over the world. They've become millionaires and multimillionaires in America. They've become multimillionaires in Europe. The moment they want to take their proceeds and send it back to Africa to develop Africa, they want to send those savings back to Africa for Africa to create banking systems and banking institutions that can help to develop Africa. Those monies can be designated or controlled by financial action rules and regulations that are there to stop money laundering, but in actual fact, they're there to stop the development of Africa.
You know, my head is spinning, and it's spinning because when you spoke about the designation of terrorism in South Africa, or the diagnosis of certain violent crimes, we had apparently a Russian mafia boss gunned down in Cape Town. We've heard stories of, I don't know if it's Lebanese people in the East Rand here. We're hearing stories now of Pakistani, Bangladeshi puzzle shop owners, and I'm guessing, and maybe Nigerians as well. We've heard these stories of some of these people are drug traffickers, some of them are mafia, criminal lords, etc. And then there's the story. If you're a Russian businessman in South Africa, there's a chance that you came to make money here, to send it back to Russia or whatever for terrorism, whatever. If you're doing it as a Nigerian here, same. If you're doing it as a Pakistani, Bangladeshi. If white Europeans come here and they create businesses, and those businesses make money here through commodities, through labor, through farming, and that money goes to Europe, and that money goes to America, and some of that money goes to the military spend, and it goes to the politicians who, like in America, which has over 600 military bases around the world, those militaries at any given time can use violence. They can use violence onto the people of that nation. It's happening this year in Somalia for political gain, which falls into terrorism. But again, that's not terrorism. And you're saying now the nations that are trying to equalize are being blocked. And you can't go to America and send money to South Africa. They might say, no, but you might be funding terrorism. This might be drug money. This might be money laundering. You're like, but the Americans sending money from South Africa here, why is that not the... These are the reasons why I said to you, I don't want to disrupt you when you speak, because I realize I get emotional and triggered because you remind me of how fucked up this world is. You remind me of who the bullies in this world are and how they bully unabated and no one can do or say anything. And the people that we entrust as leaders, not only do they do nothing, but they work in cahoots with these people. And they're the ones saying, no, but America's recommended. No, we got this from the UN. No, but the IMF. Oh, Nelson Mandela went to the World Economic Forum. He came back and said, no, fuck nationalization. We're going to align to this. Sat with Margaret Thatcher and said, no, let's do this. And you're like, clearly the leaders that we have don't care about, or the leaders in inverted commas that were placed, clearly they have been placed there not for the benefits of our people, but for the benefits of other people. And by and large, Africans, Asians are nothing more than servants, slaves, workers and tools for the power that is America, for the power that is Europe and the United Kingdom. And anyone who tries to stand up, whether it's a Russia, a China, or North Korea, we are pumped. When you think of movies in your head, it's Russians, it's the Russians. Oh, it must be criminals. Oh, it's the Koreans. Oh, there were some Arab guys from the Middle East, the terrorists. We as normal citizens who are meant to have a brain, we have been fed this bullshit. And if you watch some of the later movies now, some of the terrorists become Nigerians. Some of the terrorists become black Africans. And you're like, at no point is it ever a white American or white European. That's a terrorist. That's a criminal. That's funneling money from other nations to go and fund exactly what they say they're trying to stop. And it's upsetting.
The problem is it's no longer the Americans, because the Financial Action Task Force has created 40 recommendations. Those recommendations are not international law. A lot of those recommendations that they're making are contrary to the Constitution of South Africa and the constitutions of other countries within the region. And right now we've got our parliamentarians looking at the recommendations put forward by the Financial Action Task Force, and they're going to be forced to make laws that are contrary to the South African Constitution to please laws made unilaterally by our colonizers, but not made by international law. That doesn't make sense.
I want to disrupt you about drugs.
Just 2 seconds.
Sure.
I just wanted to say something. So you have African bankers signing up to these Financial Action Task Force regulations, knowing very well that the greatest crash of the banking system was caused by American and European banks in what was the greatest fraud, the greatest predicate crimes that crashed the banking system and lost the world over $40 trillion in 2008.
Greed.
And even though our bankers know that, they know that not a single European bank was blacklisted. Not a single European financial system was blacklisted for money laundering and predicate crimes.
Reckless lending.
They know that the terrorists all across the world are utilizing American weapons. They are utilizing American money. That money is moved through the European banking system. Not a single American bank has ever been blacklisted by the Financial Action Task Force. We know that Glencore right now bribed senior members of different governments all across the African continent, including South Africa. But today, Glencore's accounts have not been closed. Their assets have not been forfeited. Their assets have not been seized. There is no investigation on them. There is no sanctioning of Glencore by the Financial Action Task Force, the Americans, and anybody else. We know Glencore funds terrorists and rebels in Congo and other places. We know this.
These are facts.
These are facts. But they have never been blacklisted together with the Anglo-America that was causing deaths in Sierra Leone for diamonds with De Beers. But they've never been blacklisted. But our bankers, black bankers, people with PhDs, people with master's degrees will go and accede and sign these FATF regulations made by these criminal countries that enslaved us, that continue to take money out of Africa through companies that are holding on to what they took during colonialism in what was a crime against humanity. And you ask yourself, what idiots do we have right now? Go on to 702. Listen to what Lesetja Kanyako is saying. Listen to what
the governor of the Reserve Bank.
Governor of the Reserve Bank of South Africa is saying. Listen to what Sim Shabalala from Standard Bank is saying. Useless information that South Africa must comply and conform to regulations made unilaterally by our colonizers to make us less competitive, making rules that don't apply to them, and they're going to apply it in the banking system of South Africa. They will close Gupta bank accounts for allegations in the media.
Allegations and reputational damage.
Glencore was found guilty.
No reputational damage.
It was found guilty. It admitted to these. But Glencore's accounts are not closed, but Gupta accounts were closed.
Iqbal
Segunjalo, they tried to close the accounts. Iqbal Survey went to the Equality Court. And I asked myself, what idiots do we have
Maybe they're
as
not
black
idiots.
people in the system?
Maybe they're not idiots.
But if they're not idiots, why would you apply laws on your own people?
It means they're not serving their people. Maybe they're not their people.
That is scary. Because if black people have black people, like you're saying, who believe that they're part of a colonial apartheid banking system, that they must make rules that stop black people from transacting and flowing of money, and they arbitrarily close bank accounts, what they do to Zimbabweans who are on the American sanctions list, without being tried, without going to court, their bank accounts are closed. Zimbabwean billionaires have got their bank accounts closed just because the Americans put them on illegal sanctions. Yet they never went to court. They were not found guilty with anything. And this is the laws that we are being asked. The South African Parliament is being asked to make by the Financial Action Task Force. They're saying you should be able to confiscate any proceeds of any account that is deemed to either money launder or deemed to be funding terrorism. They even go further to say...
Deemed.
They're saying to South Africa must
not proven beyond reasonable doubt.
The recommendations say that you must also make laws in a country that when people, banking executives, banking workers, and banking directors flag an account for money laundering, funding terrorism, or funding the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, if they so suspect and they flag that account and they give information illegally, they give information outside the procedures of the bank, they give information outside the constitution of the South African law, those people should be protected by a law that the South African government or any other government must create to protect them for leaking such information and for flagging an account, even if it is eventually discovered that the flagging was wrong and there's no evidence to prove that there was money laundering. So they're asking our countries to make laws that are contrary to the laws. They say that politically exposed persons, you must identify through a banking system, politically exposed persons. So this is a person who's doing business with government, but the black ones, because Anglo-America is not considered as politically exposed. Glencore is not considered as politically exposed. Segunjalo, what is this other coal company? All the coal companies, the 7 of them in South Africa that belong to Western companies are not politically exposed. But the moment it's a Gupta, the moment it's a South African businessman who's got relationships, black businessman who's got relationship with the South African government, he must be considered as a politically exposed person. His account must be monitored. There must be permission acquired from the directors of the bank, these racist banks that have created laws through the Reserve Bank Act to ensure, and the Reserve Bank registrar, to ensure that there can never be black banks. They're the ones that must sit and decide whether they can open a bank account for the politically exposed person. And they can arbitrarily decide not to open an account for that person. And they will monitor his account and the funds that go. That is contrary to the Constitution of South Africa that says everybody is equal and there should be no discrimination. People must be treated with equality and they're innocent till proven guilty. Investigations must happen on people's accounts even if they haven't committed a crime. That is contrary to the Bill of Human Rights or the Universal Bill of Human Rights and the Constitution of South Africa. Those are the laws that currently your government and your parliament are being forced to make by the Financial Action Task Force, which is not an international organization, which is not a multilateral institution, which is an organization created by the biggest criminals, the biggest thieves, the biggest money launderers, and the biggest funders of terrorism and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. That is clearly problematic.
Political exposure, and I'm thinking the current president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa's bank accounts to this day have still not been unsealed for us to see who funded him, because those are meant to be politically exposed individuals or people or corporations. The second thing, I hope you're going to begin understanding part of why I realize or I accepted that race politics is dangerous. Because there are people that serve other people who happen to share a race with us, a skin color. And as long as we believe they are our people, we are left exposed to be manipulated by them. And you say words like, what kind of idiots? And I might be like, they might not be idiots, but maybe they don't serve you. You guys just happen to share a race. What I wanted to say earlier, because you speak about the Bill of Human Rights, you speak about the Constitution, the irony of the drug trade. The world was locked down for 2 years and constitutions were bypassed so that later on drugs could be traded in the form of what we call
vaccines.
Yeah. The irony of that constitutions can be bypassed. So if you're going to say it's unconstitutional, those same people that make these decisions are going to say, but this is in the interests of your nation. Terrorism, drug trafficking, and does your nation want to be exposed? No, so you'll have to override, as you did during the lockdown, you'll have to override the constitution for the greater good. But then you have to listen to us. And the people you're saying are making the decisions, Ulisitja Kganyago is obviously the governor of the Reserve Bank. You have people like Tito Mboweni, which shares there. You have people like Pravin Gordhan, which shares there. Those are meant to be the black people taking care of other black people. They are meant to be the ones saying we need black banks, as an example. And they're not. And they're saying, no, but we have to abide by the rule of law and align with international law and.
And this is my problem. And I think part of why this program is very important is that what is called best practice in international law oftentimes is not international law or best practice. And so Bob Pravin Gordhan, together with people like Kganyago and Tito Mboweni, who I think is a clown, quite frankly, they then come across like they're trying to help us to be part of the international community when they're actually implementing what are the Washington Consensus and the Atlantic Alliance rules and regulations of our colonizers. And we are the only time we believe that there's no races at play is when black people are involved.
Of course.
White people will never join black people to advance black interests. It doesn't happen, will never happen. That's why we've never been compensated for slavery, colonialism. That's why South Africa never got reparations after this crime against humanity that is acknowledged by everybody of apartheid. Yet the Jews were given 140 billion ever since the Second World War, just for 5 years of oppression. So that goes to show you that white people will stand with white people. The only dumb creature on earth that will stand with animals that are not related to it in order to subjugate their own people are black people. And they don't learn from history. But they don't learn from history, because when our chiefs sold fellow Africans into slavery, they thought that they were benefiting until the European realized how stupid we are and colonized us on our own continent and colonized those chiefs as well, who lost everything that they had made during this period. Bole Secha don't understand that they can build as much money as possible, paper money, but at the end of the day, when whites want to take what they want to take here, they will come with jets and bombs like they did in Libya, like they did in Iraq. They'll take everything, including what Bole Secha have. And on that day, they'll be like everybody else, which is why it makes sense for them to be fighting to build a commonwealth for black people that will be able to help us to industrialize and create our own weapons to defend ourselves, if indeed that day comes. But they're not thinking like that. This issue that we're talking about with FATF, it happened in Zimbabwe. The Financial Action Task Force grey-listed Zimbabwe 2 years ago. And last year, they intended to blacklist the Zimbabwean financial system. I wrote an article where I was saying to the Zimbabwean people, we are going to be blacklisted by the Financial Action Task Force because they want to remove the illegal sanctions, which they are seeing building. A lot of pressure is building against them on these illegal sanctions. So they want to remove the sanctions and then utilize a blacklisting by the Financial Action Task Force to actually cripple the Zimbabwean financial system by removing it from the international banking system. So the Minister of Justice saw that article and he got in touch with me. He asked us to have
Minister of Justice in Zimbabwe.
In Zimbabwe. He said, let's have a call. We had a call for about an hour or two. We had a conversation. He says, explain to me, what is this grey listing? Why is it happening? How does it turn into blacklisting? And what does it do for Zimbabwe? And what are the solutions? We talked. He was surprised by what I was saying. And I told him that you and your bankers, your reserve bankers, your bankers in Zimbabwe have acceded to these rules made by the same people who've got sanctions on you, who are now trying to use their own laws as international law to blacklist your financial system. And what you need to do is you need to make sure that the UN comes into Zimbabwe to actually measure the current existing economic war that has blocked legitimate channels of financing and international funding and international trade, and has forced you to use other alternatives that are then considered by the same people who put sanctions on you as money laundering and means of financing terrorism. He was like, wow. Like when the UN proclaims the illegality of the current financial war that you're under of sanctions, they will then make a clear lighting of the illegality of people trying to then blacklist you for using alternative channels when they've closed the legitimate channels. The Zimbabwean government went and implemented some of what the finance minister said I must write in my proposal for him as to the solutions to the problem. They used that and they were removed from the grey list. And today Zimbabwe is not on a grey list. Yet South Africa is on a grey list when it is less conforming, and it is better conforming to the FATF or the Financial Action Task Force recommendations than Zimbabwe. Tell me why. And South Africa is the only African country that is a member of the 39 nations that are members of the Financial Action Task Force. And there's only one reason why that happens, because your banking system is white owned. The Reserve Bank of South Africa is privately owned. This banking system is still a Western banking system, a British, American, French, and G8 banking system that they can utilize to impose their rules on the rest of Africa. Now, many people might say, but it's probably the most competent banking system on Africa. It's not true. South Africa has got one of the highest poverty rates on the African continent, highest inequality on the African continent. South Africans rose up against the apartheid government because of incompetence and the inability of that government to give 90% of the people anything, including housing, toilets. So that's a failed banking system. Yet it is the richest country on earth, which has given over $12 trillion of wealth to the country. How didn't it manage such a lot of wealth and make sure that every South African is living comfortably? How can Dubai be richer than South Africa when it has given less resources to the world than South Africa? Because of an incompetent banking system that is a thieving banking system that relies on creating rules like FATF, like the Financial Action Task Force regulations, to continue the pillaging of South Africa for the purpose of serving the masters that have made South Africa an incorporation or a private entity.
You know, I'm thinking what I wanted to say earlier. The reason why the political leaders won't serve the people is because they believe they got reparations as individuals. Because South Africans said they want land, they want a share of the economy, the resources, and the political leaders got that through BEE. It was meant to shut the rest of us up because they gave us black billionaires and millionaires who seem to be serving agendas that are not local agendas for the masses. What does the average South African do to fight back, considering how strong America is, how strong the United Nations is, and how, in my opinion, our political leaders and our business leaders are not serving the South African people. They are serving the United Kingdom, Europe, America, and to some degree, Asia as well. What does the ordinary South African who's listening to you getting angry, what do they do?
That's a good question. Last time when we had a discussion, I remember telling you that people say Tata Mandela sold out. And I refuse that because Tata Mandela negotiated a deal that allowed South Africans to have a vote, to elect their members of parliament, and to have a parliament that can actually change the rules and the laws of this country. And South Africa has had ANC has had 2/3 majority at least 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
in which they could have changed the constitution of the country. They could have changed every law that they wanted to change in the country, but they didn't. So for me, what that illustrates to you is that you have the power. The power of changing this country lies within what the ANC and the EFF and other black parties have in combination. They have 2/3 majority to change the constitution and the laws of this country. Them not wanting to do that is them wanting to be complicit, but also them ignoring the power that they actually have. So I want to tell every South African that your parliamentarians, your black parliamentarians, your lawmakers have the power, but they refuse to utilize the power. And they refuse to utilize the power, firstly, because they're serving their own self-interest, which means that they're stealing from the South African people, but more critically, some of them because they're ignorant. You can't want the paper money that these whites give out when you can control the gold, the coal. And I put coal there because coal is actually the biggest resource making the most money for most people in this country. Mm. The platinum, you can control it by legislation. You can control it by making the right policies. You can even make companies of South Africa that were there during apartheid pay reparations. You have the power to do that, and they know that. The whites know it. The only people that don't know it are the blacks. So the blacks need to know that they've got the power to change this situation. And the power to change this situation starts with conversations like this.
But they must keep voting for the same parties?
I don't know if you can vote for anybody else, because the moment you vote for the whites...
No, not white people. It's not about race. I'm talking about a situation where you're voting for people that are... as I don't even know what I'm saying, because the ANC in itself keeps promising these things, but they don't do them. They've had so many resolutions at various conferences. They get raised. Jacob Zuma's raised them again. Thabo Mbeki's raised them again. Resolutions that were made long ago in the ANC by a black ANC and a black government, and they don't implement them. So I was going to say vote for political parties that claim that they will change, but the ANC and the EFF are exactly that. And my question is that every South African must keep voting for these guys, that every South African must keep believing in this constitution. And the fear for me is, even if the ANC, EFF did decide to change the constitution, change the laws, number one, will they change it at a time where they've already figured out how to manipulate the system thereafter? In the same way today we've got a black government, but we don't. Or what happens after that? Will South Africa then be accused of human rights violations and being sanctioned like a Zimbabwe, where when the leadership says black people are going to get the land, the resources, nope, it's a human rights violation. We're sanctioning you. We're sending the task force. We're sending the UN. This is maybe even an act of terrorism, and we're shutting you guys down. And
so,
are we stuck? Is there no way out?
There's always a choice.
Should we just behave?
There's always a choice. And South Africa's choice is to either do the right thing, which is to correct the problem, and then be willing to suffer for it, or to maintain the status quo, which is going to lead to a civil war at some point. You see,
every South African is not equipped to fight. Never mind in a civil war, just in a punch-up.
No. No country was ever prepared to fight. My ancestors, or the people that fought for our liberation, were never trained at warfare. And white people made sure that we had no guns, no access to guns, and that we'd be even arrested for fighting on the streets to try and stop us from being aggressive. But when the time came for us to fight for our liberation, we learned how to use those guns, and we learned to defeat the white man with those guns. So anybody can do it. A boy from Tembisa who is hungry, and a boy from Soweto who is hungry, a boy who can spin a gusheshe, given an AK-47 for just a short period of time, will become a master at it the same way he mastered the gusheshe. And that's what you need to understand, is the danger of South Africa not doing the right thing now, is that this will eventually lead to a civil war. Why? Because the Chinese are looking, the Russians are looking, the terrorists are looking, the so-called terrorists. They're looking at this South Africa, which has a problem that is ready to explode if weapons can be injected into the system. We've got a xenophobia that is rising against foreigners who've got access to weapons and who are terrorists and who are trained where they come from, who can also infuse the problem by putting weapons into the economy. So the system that we're living in is going to collapse at some point, and it will collapse violently. And there will be weapons provided by other nations that can provide those weapons when the time comes. And we're saying to avoid that, to avoid the Russians arming one side, to avoid the Chinese arming another side, to avoid the Iranians arming another side, to cause a civil war so that they can be the ones that take the spoils of the resources of this country, do the right thing now and do the painful thing now, which is to fix the injustice of the past and to give the resources and the wealth of this country to its rightful owners and go under sanctions. That's not going to be avoidable.
And do it peacefully.
And you said, should they? No, it's not going to be peaceful. It's going to be peaceful, yes, to a certain extent. The truth of the matter is, if you make legislation, make the policies, and then you're put under sanctions, that will stick. And if a war then decides to happen, then my question is, who is going to be the beneficiary of that war?
Of course.
Because those that want to protect their control of the economy right now, they've spread themselves too thin. The South African white man is greedy, and he has spread himself so wide that he can't defend what is his. He will never be able to defend it successfully. He will lose that war. And he knows that. And they amassed all this wealth to be comfortable. Their comfort does not allow them to go into the bush for 6 months, 12 months, like what their forefathers did during the Anglo-Boer War. They'll never be able to do it. They will lose that war, and smart people should know that.
Our nuclear program in South Africa was shut down.
2 seconds. I just wanted to say one more point. You asked, should these people continue to elect the same people? They have no option. Because in South Africa, the day that you elect the DA or any white party,
it's still a race thing, not an ideology thing.
For me, it's a race thing, and I'll explain to you why.
Okay.
The race that we're competing against is about its race. And they will protect their race at all costs. They will use legislation. They will use institutions to control. They will get
favorable black people
to be
the faces.
The moment that you vote them into a national government and put them in coalition in that national government, their level of tenacity, their level of discipline, their level of organization and strategy will eventually make them outmaneuver the black party that they'll be in coalition with, and they will then hold on to power forever. And then they will use all sorts of tactics, institutions, unfair laws to keep black people out of the political space. Because they've already done it economically.
And black faces?
Economically, you can see that South Africa has been free for 28 years. But the South African economy has not changed, according to a Stellenbosch study that says 93% of the economy of South Africa is still in the hands of whites and Indians. And black people, including the foreigners, only control 7%. They've been able to do that economically. Imagine what they can do when you give them political power and they control the military, they control the police, they control institutions. Right now, they've satisfied or forced black people, Kodongwa, to say that all of a sudden now there's no more BEE in state-owned enterprises.
He's the Minister of Finance.
Yes.
Enoch Kodongwa.
State-owned enterprises must no longer adhere to BEE. Yet 98% of all contracts of those institutions goes to whites, but it's time to do away with BEE. How ignorant is that?
Do you believe that DA would use black faces?
Yes, they would use black faces, but once they're in power, and once they've got sufficient power like they do in Cape Town, in the metro in Cape Town and the Western Cape, they won't need those black faces anymore. They will be able to have a democratically elected apartheid government that will then get the protection of the UN, get the protection of its Western allies with what is called a democratic mandate. You don't want to be in a situation like that with white people, because then you are becoming Australia, you're becoming United States, and under those conditions, they can do anything. Do you not
think the ANC and the EFF are black faces for a white agenda?
No. I'll explain to you why. The EFF and the ANC are still black people. I think they're not stupid enough not to know that white people hate them, and white people would do anything to destroy them if they get the opportunity. Julius knows that if white people had their way, they would send him to jail. ANC members know that they could be sent to jail. If they've got money, they'll be sent to jail for corruption under frivolous conditions by white people. They know that. And they also know that if a DA comes into national power and is able to start influencing institutions of the state, able to influence prosecuting authorities, able to influence the police, investigations, and soldiers. Chances of any of the ANC black faces ever sitting at the table with them are very low, because a lot of them will be destroyed by the use of institutions and courts to arrest a lot of the black people that have got money, so that they will never be able to fund future politicians and future political parties, or a re-rising of black people. That's what they do in Western Cape. Western Cape is a place where black people have a ceiling. You get a professional level, to a certain point you have to leave and come to Joburg, because you're not going to go any further, because they won't allow you to continue to progress, to create a middle class and a society of elites or captains of industry who have the power to influence institutions, companies, and people who will take over for power or challenge them for power. So white people destroy competition.
I've heard that the Western Cape is tough for black people.
Yes, and in South Africa will be tough as Western Cape if the DA gets anywhere close to national power. They will utilize their might, their business community, white capital, to manipulate. Look in banking. We've no black bank till today. Why? Yet the policymakers are black, because they use their power within these institutions to continue white domination and white monopoly. If we put them in power, if we put democratic apartheid in power, we must know that it's over, and black people will suffer like they've never suffered before.
If the ANC and EFF, in your opinion, are still black, why have those leaders not uplifted and built up the townships and where they come from? And why have they all moved out of there and moved into the suburbs?
I've seen a great improvement of the townships in this country. When I came here, there used to be dust roads in most of the townships that I used to go, including Soweto. People would sleep with girls for taxi tour. Girls were at home without jobs soon after matric. They were at home without studying soon after matric. I saw that change with my own eyes. A situation where...
Do you think that was what the ANC wanted, or do you think this was the negotiation they had with the incumbents, that you have to give the people something, otherwise they will rise up, and then after they calm down, we'll wind it down to a point where today we give them 350 only and nothing else. And at that point, they will have become so weak that we can do whatever we want with them.
I think it was what the ANC did, because if that was a strategy from the whites should have used that strategy to preserve themselves. The reason why whites got overthrown is because they totally disregarded black people to a point where black people had nothing to lose. What the ANC have given people within the townships, the little that they've given, if they've given people something to lose. Right now, if you say to black people, let's have a revolution, it'll be very difficult, because most black people are comfortable enough not to want to revolt. That was something that came with the ANC. And if the whites had had that strategy, they would have implemented it during apartheid to ensure that they would never get overthrown. They got overthrown because white people do not...
But maybe that was the negotiation, right? Maybe that was where the black minds came and said, guys, listen to us. The game can keep going. Bring some of us to the table. And then for the rest, because they're angry, let's give them just a little bit. Something to lose. Make them desperate. Take away all their skills. Make sure they never get the land, but they live in the hope of the promised land. And then after that, we'll just carry on as we were. And we'll always pacify them with a few black faces here and there. But we'll keep the agenda the same. I ask this because, again, have we seen this black government? I know almost 30 years is not a long time, but have they fundamentally built institutions and spaces and ensure that even in the education system, that the skills and the knowledge being shared with the black child is such that that child can arm themselves, grow their own food, be strong, and become something in the world? Or have they actually made, even from apartheid times, made the black child weaker than they ever were?
It's tricky for me to say. I don't want to be disrespectful to the ANC to totally make them seem like they have not done anything. Because like I've said to you, I actually feel they've done
a lot. I agree with you. When I look at the roads being built, I think over 5 million RDP houses.
And so I think it's
electricity,
unfair for me.
Flushing toilets, they've done a lot.
And I think it's unfair for me, therefore, to take their credit for what it is that they've done by saying that they were just working to try and preserve the white system in the process. I think the ANC...
Would we call that empowerment, what they did? They did something. Would that be called empowerment?
It's empowerment. I'll tell you why I call it empowerment. You know, Jacob Zuma made the most black millionaires when he was in government. Mm-hmm. And he made them because of a deliberate intention to give tenders to black people to empower black companies. I even saw guys rising from nothing to something within that period. I don't think that was just trying to put money in a few people's pockets. That was actually trying to transform the economy.
You don't think he was trying to build his own army?
And
we spoke earlier about money laundering and people that come here to send money back to their nations to empower themselves. Don't you think he was doing that strategically to also create a base for himself of people that can protect him, fight for him, or his faction, not necessarily for the transformation of Black South Africans as a whole?
Whatever it may be.
Because some people judge him for the Guptas, what he did for the Reddy family, the Sheikhs, etc.
Whatever the deal might be, it did empower Black people. And even if you look at how the Guptas get into the equation, people make it sound like the Guptas are Jacob Zuma's people. From our understanding, the Guptas are ANC people. And they are ANC people because they were the few people who've got capital outside the white monopoly system that could have been used to actually change and transform this economy and its ownership structure. So they were Indians. They came into this country during the period of transition. They had money, real money, which could be used to fund Black businesses, to fund the capture of communication and media institutions, and to actually buy and capture banking systems, which is what Iqbal Survey is trying to do now. He's trying to create a Black bank. And the reason the whites are now trying to destroy him and trying to close his companies is they don't want him to use his money that he's made as an Indian to actually start benefiting what could actually then filter down to Black people. And so that is the problem. But the ANC chose to try and have a trickle-down effect rather than trying to nationalize and take what belongs to Black South Africans. And I think that's where the mistake was. But I understand why they made the mistake, because Mugabe made the same mistake too. He felt and he believed in the theory of whites to say we can work together. We can build a non-racial society together. They didn't learn the secret that white supremacy does not believe in raising other people, raising other races. And how do we know? You need to look at Black Americans in America. They are very backward. The richest Black billionaire is in Africa and not an African American. Why? In England and Europe, there's no single Black billionaire. The only Black billionaire right now in Europe is Strive Masiwa, who is a product of Zimbabwe and Zimbabwe's indigenization policy. So we have leaders who have bought the Kool-Aid without looking at empirical evidence. And this is what I am saying in this project and program we're having now. Don't listen to what white people say. Look at what they did. When America wanted to emancipate itself after liberation from England, did it listen to what the British wanted? Did it follow British systems? Or did they decide to destroy the whole system? And this brings me back to the issue of this FATF, Financial Action Task Force, and anti-money laundering laws. A lot of European countries were built by piracy. America was built by piracy. They put ships, very fast frigates, onto the high seas to attack British ships, to attack French ships, to attack Spanish ships, and to take their wealth and to utilize that to build the American system. The Israelis did the same thing. They sent people from their Mossad unit that was known as Larkham to go into countries all across the world, steal technology, steal knowledge, and they came and created industry in Israel. They even used stolen funds and monies and proceeds of money laundering from colonialism to build their country. We as Africans need to do the same thing. But if our leaders are going to sign up to Financial Action Task Force regulations, if they're going to create legislation that makes a South African who is in Europe, who is a very good credit card fraudster, makes his money there, and he can't repatriate it like the pirates of America did. He can't repatriate it like the British Cecil John Rhodes did, stealing African resources and repatriating their funds to build Britain. We will never build Africa. If we are not able to steal, if we are not able to take their intellectual property, if we're not able to repatriate what we've stolen.
We're able to steal.
Yes. And I'm unapologetic, because the Western world is built by stealing. Everything that Adam Smith and the economics textbook wrote about is a lie. It's a lie. Hey?
I'm just thinking,
I
don't think we'll have time. I wanted to speak about the fact that our nuclear program in South Africa was shut down when the ANC came into power. And I'm just thinking a lot of these ideas, when the rest of the world is not happy with who's leading a country, they do shut some of those ideas down because they know their agenda won't be served. You owe me another come back, another sit down. We still haven't unpacked the South African economy.
Yes.
But I think this was probably more important and more urgent. So thank you very much for coming through, and I look forward to you coming through again. I know if I ask you a question, we're going to run for another 20 minutes. So thank you very much, Rutendo.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I just want to say one thing. I'll leave you with a challenge.
Yeah.
You said that when the West are not happy with certain people ruling, when they're not happy with black people. So even though I understand you don't want to focus on race, you're going to see that this thing always leads us back to race.
I hear you. Thank you.
It's great, brother.